On Christmas night, she went to sleep in her warm bed. By morning, her father carried her lifeless body from the basement. What happened in those silent hours still haunts America today. It was the night of Christmas, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado. Snow rested gently on rooftops. The streets glowed with Christmas lights, and inside the Ramsey home, laughter filled the air. It was the picture of a perfect holiday. Warmth, music, and the excitement of a family living the American dream. Ramsey was a wealthy businessman who had built a successful tech company. His wife, Patsy, had once been crowned a beauty queen, and even years later, she still carried the charm and elegance of that title. Together they had 2 children, Burke, 9 years old, quiet and curious, and John Benet, their 6-year-old daughter. The shining star of their lives, John Benet was no ordinary child. She was playful, radiant, and already a tiny celebrity in Colorado. With her golden curls, sparkling costumes, and sweet smile, she competed in child beauty pageants and often brought home trophies and crowns. To her parents, she was the image of perfection, a girl who could charm anyone in an instant. To the outside world, she looked like a doll come to life. That Christmas, the Ramseys spent the day with friends, neighbors, and family. They sang carols, exchanged presents, and shared in the joy of the season. John Benet played with her new gifts, darting around with the unstoppable energy only a 6-year-old could have. To anyone watching from outside, it was the kind of family every parent dreamed of. Wealth, beauty, and the happiness of children on Christmas night. By late evening, the family returned to their sprawling home. The house, large and filled with rooms, stood like a mansion against the snowy silence. John Benet was tucked into bed, the holiday finally settling into quiet sleep. Patsy arranged things for the morning. John checked on his children one last time, and soon the Ramsey household fell silent. The only sounds were the hum of the heater and the faint wind outside. But behind that silence, something else was moving. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun rose, Patsy woke and slipped into her bathrobe. She planned to make coffee and begin the day early. As she walked down the back staircase, her eyes fell on something that made her stop. On the wooden steps, neatly placed, was a handwritten letter, not 1 page, but 3. She bent down, picked it up, and began to read. The words froze her blood. It was a ransom note. The writer claimed to be part of a foreign group, demanding money for the safe return of John Benet. But the details were bizarre. They demanded $118,000, not a rounded figure, but the exact amount John Ramsey had just received as his Christmas bonus. The letter was unusually long, more than 2 pages, filled with strange phrases that didn't match a typical kidnapping demand. Patsy's hands shook as she screamed for her husband. Moments later, her voice echoed through the phone lines as she dialed 911. The call was frantic, panicked, broken with sobs. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please hurry," she cried, pleading for help. By 6 a.m., Boulder police arrived. But what happened next would forever change the case. Instead of locking down the house, investigators allowed friends, neighbors, and even the family's pastor to come inside. The Ramsey kitchen turned into a gathering place, people walking around, touching surfaces, moving objects. A crime scene was being destroyed before it could even be studied. As hours passed, officers combed through the house but found no sign of John Benet. The ransom note sat as the only clue. Detectives waited, expecting the kidnapper to call, but no phone call ever came. Then, shortly after 1 p.m., John Ramsey, restless and desperate, decided to search the house himself. He walked into the basement, entered a small dark storage room, and stopped cold. On the floor, wrapped in a white blanket, was the body of his daughter. JonBenet was lifeless. Duct tape covered her mouth. A cord was tied tightly around her neck. Her tiny wrists were bound. The sight no parent should ever endure had become his reality. John scooped her into his arms and rushed her upstairs, crying out in anguish. His grief was raw, unbearable, but in that moment, any chance to preserve the crime scene was destroyed completely. Evidence that might have answered questions was lost forever. JonBenet had been strangled. A violent blow had fractured her skull. She had not been kidnapped, as the letter claimed. She had been murdered, but the question was, by whom? The discovery of JonBenet's body should have turned the Ramsey home into the most protected crime scene in Colorado. Instead, chaos only deepened. Officers, friends, and even relatives wandered through the house, as though it were just another tragic family gathering. Items removed, surfaces touched, and potential evidence lost with every passing minute. The Boulder Police Department, unprepared for a case of this magnitude, failed at the most critical moment. Detectives studied the ransom note again and again. It was 2.5 pages long, far more than any typical kidnapper would write. Experts said it read like a movie script, dramatic, rehearsed, even oddly theatrical. The demand for $180,000 remained the strangest detail of all. Why not $1 million? Why not something grand? Why the exact figure of John Ramsey's recent work bonus? To investigators, this didn't look like the work of a foreign group. It looked like something staged. Attention shifted quickly inside the Ramsey family. Officers noticed Patsy's behavior, her dramatic cries, her insistence on telling friends what to say to reporters, her nervous glances. They noticed John's composure, his strange decision to carry JonBenet's body upstairs, rather than leaving her in the basement for investigators. Even Burke, their 9-year-old son, became a subject of whispered questions after a disturbing television interview years later in which his mannerisms appeared unsettling. But on that first day, nothing was certain, except that the crime scene was ruined and the Ramseys were no longer just grieving parents. They were potential suspects. The autopsy revealed even more troubling details. JonBenet had been strangled with a garrote, a crude weapon fashioned from a paintbrush handle taken from Patsy's own art supplies. A violent blow had fractured her skull. There were signs that could suggest sexual assault, but the evidence was inconsistent. This combination of details, a ransom note, a strangulation, a head injury, and possible assault, baffled investigators. It didn't match a clean kidnapping. It didn't match a typical home invasion. It felt like pieces of different crimes forced together into one horrific puzzle. Whispers began to spread through Boulder. Neighbors who had once envied the Ramseys' wealth and success now exchanged knowing looks. Was the glamorous family hiding a dark secret? Was the ransom note a desperate attempt to cover up what had really happened? Or was an intruder truly lurking in the shadows that Christmas night? The media wasted no time. Reporters camped outside the Ramsey home. Television trucks lined the street. Headlines screamed across the nation, "Pageant Princess Murdered." The photographs of JonBenet in sparkling costumes, smiling with crowns and ribbons, became symbols of innocence lost, and to some critics, they became symbols of a darker world of child beauty contests, one that now looked unsettling in the light of her death. The police, under pressure, leaned harder into the idea that someone inside the home knew the truth. They believed the ransom note had been written by Patsy herself. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but similarities existed. The fact that the paper came from inside the house only added weight to the suspicion. Detectives began to press harder on the Ramseys, though no clear evidence tied them directly to the crime. The Ramseys fought back. They hired lawyers, held press conferences, and insisted they were innocent. But their insistence only made some Americans more skeptical. Why did they need such powerful attorneys if they had nothing to hide? Why did their stories sometimes shift in small but noticeable ways? With every day that passed, the case grew colder, yet the storm around it grew louder. And as weeks turned into months, what had once been a quiet investigation in Boulder transformed into a national obsession. America was no longer just watching. America was demanding answers, but the louder the media shouted, the further the truth seemed to slip away. Was justice for JonBenet being uncovered, or was it being buried beneath suspicion, speculation, and scandal? The death of JonBenet Ramsey no longer belonged only to Boulder. Within days, it belonged to the entire nation. The media seized on every detail, every photograph, every whisper, until the story became a 24-hour spectacle. On magazine covers, JonBenet's face appeared again and again, not just as a victim, but as the pageant princess whose glittering costumes and tiaras suddenly looked haunting. For many, the images symbolized innocence. For others, they carried a disturbing undertone. Why was a 6-year-old dressed and paraded this way? Why had her parents pushed her into a world of adult-like competition? The pageant photographs became part of the mystery and part of the judgment. Television talk shows devoted entire episodes to debating who killed her. Tabloids ran wild headlines, jealous mother snaps, secret life of the Ramsey family. Did the brother know? Everywhere people looked, JonBenet's name was there, tangled in theories, rumors, and scandal. And through it all, suspicion never strayed far from the Ramseys themselves. Polls showed that most Americans believed one or both parents were guilty. John's wealth, Patsy's pageant ambitions, Burke's strangeness, everything about them became fuel for suspicion. To the public, they were no longer grieving parents. They were potential villains in a drama unfolding live before the world. For the Ramseys, life became unbearable. Cameras followed their every move. Reporters shouted questions when they stepped outside. Their home turned from a sanctuary into a fishbowl. Patsy, especially, became the subject of relentless scrutiny. Handwriting experts argued over whether she had written the ransom note. Some said yes. Others said no. But the doubt never left. The more the family defended themselves, the more the media twisted their words. When they hired high-profile attorneys, the press claimed it was proof of guilt. When they broke down on camera, critics called it an act. No matter what they did, the court of public opinion had already ruled against them. But behind the circus, investigators were also divided. Some detectives were convinced the Ramseys knew more than they admitted. Others pointed to evidence suggesting an intruder, an unidentified boot print in the basement, an open window, DNA that didn't match anyone in the family. Two camps emerged, each certain of their theory, each unwilling to bend. The case that should have united police to find the killer instead turned into a bitter internal war. And while investigators fought with each other, and the media fought over headlines, the trail of the real killer grew colder by the day. JonBenét's funeral was broadcast to the world. Her small white coffin, carried by her father, became one of the most heartbreaking images of the decade. But even in grief, the cameras never turned away. America wasn't just mourning JonBenét. America was consuming her story like entertainment. And as weeks became months, the media frenzy only deepened. Theories grew stranger, rumors darker. Every day brought a new headline, a new accusation, a new twist. But beneath the noise, one haunting truth remained. A child had been murdered in her own home on Christmas night. And no one could say for certain who had done it. As the months passed, the mystery of JonBenét Ramsey's death twisted into a war of theories. The case split the public, the police, and even the experts into two bitter camps. On one side stood those who believed the answer was right inside the Ramsey home. On the other stood those convinced a stranger had slipped into the house that night. The family theory began with the ransom note. Investigators could not ignore the fact that it was written on stationery from inside the Ramsey home. Not only that, but it was unusually long, filled with odd phrases that sounded more like a script than a real demand. It was as if someone had taken time, far too much time, to craft a letter meant to mislead. And many suspected that person was Patsy Ramsey herself. Handwriting comparisons revealed similarities. Experts argued endlessly, but the shadow of suspicion clung to her. Then there was John Ramsey, who had found his daughter's body and carried her upstairs. Some investigators believed no guilty father would expose his crime so openly. Others believed no innocent father would destroy so much evidence in the most crucial moment. Every action John took was read in two opposite ways, fueling more suspicion. And what about Burke, the quiet 9-year-old boy? Years later, in interviews, his odd smiles and strange responses would reignite questions. Did a sibling quarrel turn violent that night? Did parents stage the ransom note and scene in panic to protect their son? The theory haunted the investigation, even if no clear proof tied Burke to the crime. But not everyone believed the family was guilty. The intruder theory carried its own disturbing weight. Down in the basement, investigators found a broken window, a possible point of entry. Near JonBenét's body, there was an unidentified boot print that matched no one in the household. Most chilling of all, forensic tests revealed unknown DNA on JonBenét's clothing. DNA that did not belong to John, Patsy, or Burke. Someone else had been there. The garrote, the crude weapon used to strangle JonBenét, was another puzzle. It seemed deliberately fashioned, almost ritualistic. Would a panicked parent have thought to construct such a device? Or was it the work of an intruder, someone who came prepared? And yet, skeptics pointed out flaws. If an intruder had entered, why take the time to write a 3-page ransom note? Inside the home, why not simply take the child and leave? Why demand an oddly specific amount of money instead of something larger? Nothing about the intruder theory fit neatly, just as nothing about the family theory fit neatly. Theories spun. Further, some whispered of a family friend or neighbor, someone close enough to know the details of John's bonus. Others suggested darker motives, a stalker obsessed with JonBenét's pageant performances, hiding in the shadows until the night of Christmas. But with every possibility came doubt. Every clue had two interpretations, every piece of evidence, two meanings. And while the world argued over who killed JonBenét, the one person who could never answer was the little girl herself. By the end of 1997, the case was no closer to being solved. Instead, It had become a battlefield of theories, each one tearing apart the other, each one leaving the truth buried deeper under suspicion and confusion. By the late 1990s, the case of JonBenet Ramsey had grown into one of the most notorious, unsolved mysteries in America. Pressure on investigators was enormous. The media circus showed no signs of slowing, and the people of Boulder wanted justice. In 1999, a grand jury was convened to review the evidence. For months, they examined the ransom note, the autopsy, and the conflicting theories. In a stunning but secret decision, the grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey for child abuse resulting in death. But when the time came to act, the district attorney refused to sign the charges. He claimed the evidence was too weak, that there was no way to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The decision remained hidden for years until the public finally learned of it in 2013. By then, it was far too late. Meanwhile, science was advancing. DNA technology, still in its early years in 1996, grew sharper in the 2000s. Samples from JonBenet's clothing were tested again and again. Each time, results pointed to an unidentified male profile. Not John, not Patsy, not Burke, for defenders of the Ramsey family, it was proof they were innocent. For skeptics, it was not enough. Perhaps the DNA came from contamination. Perhaps it was unrelated. Once again, answers slipped into arguments. False leads only deepened the tragedy. In 2006, a schoolteacher named John Mark Carr confessed to killing JonBenet. He gave vivid details, enough to convince some investigators. But when his DNA was tested, it did not match. His confession collapsed. Another cruel twist in a case already drowning in confusion. As the years rolled on, the case never left the headlines for long. Documentaries, TV specials, books. Every few years, JonBenet's face returned to the public eye, her smile frozen. In time, her tragedy never resolved. For many Americans, she became a symbol of innocence lost, of justice delayed, of a system that failed a child. In 2006, another shadow fell over the case when Patsy Ramsey lost her battle with ovarian cancer. She went to her grave still accused by millions of being her daughter's killer, never cleared, never convicted, trapped forever between suspicion and denial. John Ramsey, left to carry the weight, continued to fight publicly for his family's name, while Burke tried to live a life beyond the headlines, but he could never truly escape them. Even today, more than 25 years later, the questions remain. Who wrote the ransom note? Who left DNA that matched no one in the home? Why did the police fail at every crucial moment? And most haunting of all, was JonBenet killed by someone she trusted, or by a stranger who vanished into the night? The lights of Boulder still shine at Christmas. The snow still falls, the houses still glow, and families still gather around trees with laughter and warmth. But for one family, Christmas will always carry the shadow of that night in 1996, the night innocence was stolen. The night a little girl's life was taken in the place she should have been safest, her own home. JonBenet Ramsey was 6 years old. She should have grown up, gone to high school, chased her dreams, maybe stood on a stage one day, not as a child in a tiara, but as a woman who had found her voice. Instead, her story ended in a basement, wrapped in a white blanket, the truth buried with her. And until the day her killer is revealed, the name JonBenet will remain a question carved into America's memory, a question with no answer, a wound that time has refused to heal.